Well, when it comes to President Trump's relationship with social media, it's complicated. The president regularly uses Twitter to share his opinions and policies and even high-level staff changes directly with the public. But he's been using that platform to attack Google, tweeting last week that its search results for Trump news shows only the view or reporting of fake news media. He says they have it rigged for him and others so that all stories and news is bad. Well, 2 days later, he tweeted a video that appeared to show that Google promoted President Obama's State of the Union addresses, but not Trump's. The tweet had the hashtag #StopTheBias. Well, Google says it did promote the 2018 address, but that 2017 was not technically a State of the Union speech. Well, now let's take a closer look at the current social media landscape and Trump's unprecedented use of Twitter as his pulpit. I'm joined by Lester Munson, a principal at BGR Group here in Washington. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
So let's start with your reaction to these hearings that we heard, not just regarding the tech, but also the bias and the election meddling allegations.
Well, I think tech companies find themselves in a very uncomfortable situation. They've been under fire from the president. They're under fire from their customers, frankly, who are a little concerned about the way some of these things have evolved. And now they find themselves in a very risky position of actually advocating for their own regulation. And if you listen carefully at the hearings today, you heard the executives mention that they would, in fact, welcome sensible regulation. That should be an alarm bell for folks. I think that's a mistake for Congress because what its regulation is really going to do is prohibit smaller guys from entering the market. I hope the Wild West days stay here for quite a while.
And what about that fine line between regulating some of this content and free speech? Is that going to continue to be an issue?
It's always an issue in the United States, and I hope we always defer to the side of allowing free speech and let these companies decide for themselves. If people don't like the product, they'll stop using it.
And it's certainly a question of you don't have to click on these things if you're not interested.
That's right.
Now, obviously, a lot was made of that empty Google seat. How much should we read into Google not choosing to appear at this hearing?
Well, I think it's a mistake. Google would have done better to have sent their CEO and been there and answered the questions in a reasonable way. The American people are watching through their representatives and themselves, and they see that Facebook and Twitter was willing to kind of go and face the music. That they're going to get some credibility for that. Google's in a little bit of trouble right now.
And what's the likelihood, obviously just a short amount of time between now and the midterm elections coming up in November, is there any likelihood that we're going to see some sort of action taken on this?
I don't think there'll be any legislative action. That's a very heavy lift. Congress has tried to regulate parts of the internet before and failed miserably. It's a very difficult thing to do, but I do think there'll continue to be speeches and there'll be more pressure, and I'm sure the president is thrilled with the coverage of his tweeting on this issue, and he's going to keep doing it too.
Now, speaking of that, Trump does have a somewhat complicated and unprecedented relationship with social media. Talk more about that. Break that down for us.
Well, Twitter is his biggest and best tool. It's how he communicates directly to his voters, to all the voters, to the American people. It's how he goes around the news media, or what he calls the fake news media. So it's very useful for him. So it is ironic for him to be criticizing social media companies, to be sure, because they've really enabled him. But frankly, so have regular news outlets, more traditional news outlets, TV shows, newspapers, have thrived in the Trump era. He's terrific for ratings, and he's driven sales of newspapers. The New York Times is doing very well in circulation now, mostly because President Trump attacks them.
And it's interesting because if you look at the latest responses to Trump accusing these tech companies of being biased, not just against him, but against conservatives and Republicans, a lot of people are wondering, does the president have a point?
Well, I think he does. I think a lot of, I'm a conservative, so I understand what he's talking about. Conservatives have felt for a very long time that the news media was a little bit tilted against them, and I think there's some evidence for that. He, of course, in his own special, unique way, overstates everything, but there is a grain of truth in that, and his supporters and even some independents who might not want to support him also recognize that that's a truth.
Now, how much of that, though, is about user content versus the oversight from some of these tech companies?
Well, that's a great question, and the tech companies will happily say, look, we're just a platform. We don't actually endorse certain kinds of content, and we don't put our own content on there. That's not quite true anymore. They've started eliminating people with extreme views from their websites. Twitter is one of the lone holdouts for some of the really extreme stuff. So they're in dangerous ground right now.
And certainly inching closer and closer towards regulation. What sort of action could we see, and how much of a game changer would that be for these big tech companies?
Well, I don't think you're going to see legislative regulation, but it would not surprise me if we saw these large companies, which are doing quite well in the market and they're all profitable, actually going to the Federal Communications Commission with their own suggested regulations unilaterally and have the executive branch do it directly. That would not surprise me. I hope it's something that the government resists.
And are there any other issues that are raising concerns for the government when it comes to social media? We know there's this issue of transparency. Could these companies stand to be more transparent?
Well, I actually think they're taking a lot of steps themselves already. They realize that they got terrible press in the last presidential election in 2016. It was clear that there were a lot of fake accounts. There are still fake accounts, even though they continue to purge them. I think it's good that they're moving in that direction. I don't know how the government could force them to do that more necessarily, but I think they're actually doing the right thing there.
So just quickly, do you see this coming to a head, or do you see some sort of resolution?
Well, I think it's going to come to a head on November 5th when we have this election, and we'll see what the results are. It is entirely possible that if the Democrats take over Congress, they will make a stronger push for regulation of these companies. They're very concerned. Republicans are a little more pro-business and a little more reluctant to regulate, despite what they were saying today. So I think the results of the election could really drive the next chapter of this.
Certainly a lot hinging on that. Thank you so much. Our thanks to Lester Munson there of BGR Government Affairs, LLC.